This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/CinemaTyler. During the production of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick worked with cinematographer Jeffrey Unsworth to bring the fantasy of space exploration to life. But near the end of the 33-month-long production, Unsworth had to leave for another job and his assistant, John Alcott, took over the role of DP. As you might remember from my series on 2001, the last section of the film that was shot was the opening Dawn of Man sequence, which Alcott was tasked with shooting. Kubrick maintained complete control over the photography in his movies, but the shooting of the Dawn of Man sequence would be the beginning of a relationship that would carry through 1975's Barry Lyndon, which would earn Alcott an Oscar.
At least, but not last, Stanley Kubrick.
And 1980's The Shining. The overall approach to filmmaking in A Clockwork Orange was very different than the large-budget epic 2001, which pretty much took over the entire MGM studios in Bournemouth during filming, as well as the massive Stage H at Shepperton Studios. The production of 2001: A Space Odyssey was very slow, complex, and most importantly, costly. 2001 opened to mixed reviews, and Kubrick needed to prove to studios that he could make a relatively low-budget film. The budget for 2001: A Space Odyssey ended up around $12 million, while the budget for A Clockwork Orange was around $2 million. This would be like if Christopher Nolan followed up The Dark Knight with Memento.
Lenny! It's Leonard.
So what was it like for Kubrick to shoot a low-budget film? And what techniques did he use to make such a cinematic movie on the cheap? Well, that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of Making Film.
And what will you do with the big money? Have you not everything you need?
When comparing A Clockwork Orange to 2001: A Space Odyssey, cinematographer John Alcott said, Clockwork Orange employed a darker, more obviously dramatic type of photography. It was a modern story taking place in an advanced period of the 1980s, although the period was never actually pinpointed in the picture. It called for a really cold, stark style of photography. A Clockwork Orange can be divided into 3 sections. First, Alex and his droogs assault, steal, and rape. Second, Alex goes to prison and is given the Ludovico treatment. And third, Alex is released from prison where his previous victims exact their revenge on him. In order to separate these 3 sections, Kubrick decided on a different color palette and camera style for each. There is a really great piece on the cinematography of A Clockwork Orange in American Cinematographer by Vincent Labruto, where he talks about the differences in these styles. For the first section of Alex as a violent criminal, Kubrick and cinematographer John Alcott used, quote, a bright color presentation with high-key lighting, fluid zooms, and dolly shots. The prison section is characterized by, quote, cool, flat tones, as long takes and subtle camera moves create a somber and then clinical atmosphere. And finally, the post-treatment section, quote, returns to the environment of the first, but is rendered in gray and low-key tones. Flatter lighting and desaturated colors help to define Alex's comeuppance. Much of the lighting of A Clockwork Orange was done using practical lights, or lights that are part of the location or seen on camera. You can see many of these photoflood bulbs dressing the sets of the Korova Milk Bar and the Cat Lady's Health Farm. This was done mainly for speed and keeping the costs low, but Kubrick managed to turn the unshaded light bulbs into a style of the future.
With the rain, I've a smile on my face.
Some of the most interesting lighting fixtures are these large spherical bulbs that appear in Alex's room and in Mr. Alexander's house. And in the prison sequence, you can often find these single unshaded bulbs hanging from the ceiling. To fill out the lighting, Alcott used, quote, very lightweight Lowell 1000-watt quartz lights, bounced off the ceiling or reflective umbrellas. Because the bulk of the light was coming from the practical fixtures in the setting, and the fill lights were easy to move, this meant that Kubrick was often free to put his camera anywhere in the room fairly quick, or move around as needed, such as the shots of Alex fighting the cat lady. Alcott liked these lights because they were so versatile. That said, there were some scenes that required a larger lighting setup, like the scene of Alex and the droogs beating up the tramp. The lights were positioned to appear like the light was coming from a nearby street lamp. Makeup artist Barbara Daly said, we would always spend a lot of time with the lighting, which is the one thing I really love that Stanley always did was take a lot of time setting the scene. Many of the greatest aspects of Kubrick's films come down to the style and composition of his photography, and A Clockwork Orange is no exception. Kubrick once said in an interview, when you think of the greatest moments of film, I think you're almost always involved with images rather than scenes, and certainly never dialogue. The thing a film does best is to use pictures with music, and I think these are the moments you remember. I certainly find this to be the case. When I think of A Clockwork Orange, I immediately think of this, or this, or this. or this. In the same interview, Kubrick also spoke about how difficult it is to talk about cinematography and editing. He said, "The questions of taste involved and the decision-making criteria are essentially nonverbal, and whatever you say about them tends to read like the back of a record album. These are decisions that have to be made every few minutes during the shooting, and they're just down to the director's taste and imagination."
Oh, there. That's all there is to it.
But with all that said, Kubrick revealed the most important thing he keeps in mind while directing: make it interesting. You have to make sure that every part of the story is interesting, every part of the acting is interesting, every part of the photography is interesting, and so on. So what does this mean? It means that you can get everything perfect, understanding the story and characters, believability, and so on, but it still won't be a good movie if it isn't interesting. You have to find a way to get the audience to want to engage with what is going on. You ever notice how everyone can't help but look at an accident on the side of the road, or how a class of children can't focus on anything else once a puppy is brought in? Kubrick's brother-in-law and frequent producer, Jan Harlan, says it has to do with heightening situations, whether they are good or bad, and that all of our stories are connected deep down with what we love or fear. Of course, you have to make sure that you're heightening in such a way that isn't cliché. In order to be visually interesting, Kubrick tried to come up with a cinematic style similar to A Clockwork Orange author Anthony Burgess's literary style, as well as Alex's subjective view of the world. Still, Kubrick says that this all boils down to intuition over analysis. Part of this intuition had Kubrick looking to use long, continuous zooms in the telling of the story. Kubrick was always interested in the most cutting-edge technology, and if that technology didn't already exist or wasn't widely available, he'd opt to have something custom-made for his needs. Legendary cinematographer Haskell Wexler tipped Kubrick off to a man named Ed DeGuglio, who was the president of Cinema Products Corporation in LA. Wexler told him that DeGuglio was, quote, responsive to the demanding requirements of filmmakers. DeGuglio bought a standard Mitchell B&C camera to modify for Kubrick and added joystick control for smooth operation of zoom lenses, as well as a B&C crystal motor. DeGuglio would later modify Kubrick's Mitchell B&C camera to be able to mount the ultra-fast Zeiss f/0.7 lens for the candlelight scenes in Barry Lyndon. For A Clockwork Orange, DeGuglio didn't modify the B&C camera for reflex viewing, meaning that you couldn't use the eyepiece to see exactly what the camera sees. But this gave Kubrick flexibility in the use of special lenses. Kubrick talked to DeGuglio about getting a 20:1 zoom lens for the 35mm camera. DeGuglio told Kubrick that they could, quote, take an ingenue 16mm 20:1 zoom and put a 2x extender behind it so that it would cover the 35mm format. The problem was that this would lose 2 full stops of light. DeGuglio said, the next day I get a telex that's a yard long in which Kubrick explains to me that the 35mm format he's shooting in is 1.66:1. Then he recites the Pythagorean theorem to show me how x squared plus y squared equals the diagonal root of the sum of the squares, and to point out that in going up from a 16mm format, I didn't need a 2x extender, that I could do it with a 1.61x. Therefore, I didn't have to lose 2 stops, maybe a stop or a stop and a half. Here he is lecturing me and I'm saying, why this smartass, another one of these wild-ass directors. I called my old buddy Bern Levy, who was working for Ingenue at the time, and I said, Bern, I've got this wacko director who wants to do this. Bern said, well, you know, Ed, as a matter of fact, we do have a 1.6x extender. And I said, oh, shit. This extender existed for some other application, but the bottom line is that I was able to take a 16mm zoom lens, put this extender on it, and give Stanley the exact lens he wanted. I actually got to see this lens at the Traveling Kubrick exhibit when it was in San Francisco a while back. And there it is, right in the center there. The lens would later be used for the long zoom shots in Barry Lyndon. And a side note, the lens on the left was the one that Kubrick used for this incredible shot of Nicole Kidman and Skye Dumont dancing in Eyes Wide Shut. The reason Kubrick wanted A Clockwork Orange to have a 1.66:1 aspect ratio was that there had been so many issues in the projection of 2001's 70mm, much wider 2.20:1 aspect ratio. Another reason for A Clockwork Orange's more narrow ratio was because of the dreaded pan and scan technique, where television networks would attempt to fill a square television screen with a wide image by cutting the sides off and actually moving the image back and forth to show things that would have gone beyond the boundaries of the screen. It's interesting to think that Kubrick kept television broadcasting of his movies in mind when making decisions during production. Before we move on, I want to take a second to mention this episode's bonus content. For this bonus, I made a little story breakdown tracing how all the different threads are masterfully weaved together, and why this moment is perhaps the most important turning point in the movie. It's just $1 and it really helps the channel. You can find it in the description and at the end of the video. From the beginning of his time behind the camera, Kubrick loved the simplicity of composing images with the subject in the center of the frame. He would continue this practice throughout his entire filmography, but he found that A Clockwork Orange also needed a more avant-garde approach in some parts, saying, "Telling a story realistically is such a slowpoke and ponderous way to proceed, and it doesn't fulfill the psychic needs that people have. We sense that there is more to life and to the universe than realism can possibly deal with." That said, when you watch A Clockwork Orange, you can immediately see Kubrick's simplicity even in the most stylized scenes. Every shot seems to be done with purpose and with great, pith.
Yes, pith.
Just look at the first scene between Alex and Mr. Deltoid. This entire scene is done in just 2 setups. When asked how much coverage he shoots, Kubrick said, "There's always a conflict between time, money, and quality. If you shoot a lot of coverage, then you must either spend a lot of money or settle for less quality of performance. I find that when I'm shooting a scene, I shoot a lot of takes, but I don't try to get a lot of coverage from other angles. I try to shoot the scene as simply as possible to get the maximum performance from the actors without presenting them the problem of repeating the performance too many times from different angles. On the other hand, in an action scene where it's relatively easy to shoot, you want lots and lots of angles so that you can do something interesting with it in the cutting room." Kubrick used a small Ariflex 2C camera for the handheld action shots that allowed him to not only move freely, but get much closer to the actors than the Mitchell B&C. It's possible that this was another tip from Haskell Wexler, who used the same camera to shoot the real riot in medium cool. A fair amount of the rape scene, the fight with Billy Boy's goons, and the cat lady scene were shot using this Ariflex, giving the scenes a frantic feeling of being too close to the action happening on screen. Kubrick did all the handheld camera work in the film himself, as he did in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Kubrick said, "When the camera is on a dolly, you can go over the action of the scene with the camera operator and show him the composition that you want in each point in the take. But you can't do this when the camera is handheld. Sometimes there are certain effects which can only be achieved with a handheld camera, and sometimes you handhold it because there's no other way to move through a confined space or over obstacles." In a separate interview, he continues this thought, saying, "In addition to the fun of doing the shooting myself, I find it is virtually impossible to explain what you want in a handheld shot to even the most talented and sensitive camera operator." Kubrick decided that he wanted the pivotal fight with the cat lady to be filmed handheld, showing the full 360 degrees of the space. During the shoot, Kubrick manned the RE2C camera while the crew crouched down outside the room. For these shots, it was just the actors, Kubrick with the camera, a crew member with the camera's power pack holding onto Kubrick from behind, and a journalist named Alexander Walker who held onto the crew member from behind. Walker said, "We were whirling around and it was very difficult to control the momentum, and we'd end up in a heap on the floor, or the inertia meant I'd be swung around and end up in the shot." After the film was released, Stanley sent me a couple strips of film on my appearances in A Clockwork Orange. Perhaps the most striking action scene plays out entirely in slow motion. After a threat to his leadership, Alex assaults his droogs at the Flat Block Marina. Kubrick said, "I wanted to find a way to stylize all of this violence and also to make it as balletic as possible. Alex's fight with his droogs would have lasted about 14 seconds if it wasn't in slow motion. I wanted to slow it to a lovely floating movement." Actually, let's see what this would have looked like at normal speed. It really does show the power of cinema, doesn't it? Another quote-unquote action scene was done entirely in one static shot. Alex picks up 2 young women from a record store and brings them home for a wild romp in his room to the William Tell Overture performed on synths. In the record store, which was actually the basement of the Chelsea drugstore on Kings Road, Kubrick used an ingenue 9.8mm lens that allowed for a 90-degree field of view. The lens was pretty dang fast at f/0.95, so Kubrick was able to shoot in relatively low lighting conditions. They shot the record store bit over a couple of days, and Kubrick developed a little crush on the brunette, who was Australian. She asked for her name to be taken off the credits because she didn't want her parents seeing the movie back home in Australia. I have no idea if they ever found out, but seeing as A Clockwork Orange is one of the most famous films ever made, you have to wonder if they did. All in all, the William Tell sequence took 28 minutes to shoot, with 2 exposures a second. The large Mitchell camera blocked the doorway so they couldn't get in or out. Because Kubrick was going to speed up the film and replace the sound with music, he directed the actors throughout the scene. McDowell knew about Kubrick's little crush on the brunette, so he spent extra time with her to screw with him. Kubrick would eventually say, "Okay, that's enough."
Enough!
with McDowell giggling the whole time. The William Tell scene was one of the main reasons that the movie got an X rating. Apparently, the argument was that pornographers would simply speed up their sex scenes to get a lower rating. Cultural historian Sir Christopher Frayling said that this speeding up and slowing down a film works to distance the viewer from what is happening. In this way, you gain a heightened awareness of the filmmaking process, allowing you to separate yourself from the film a bit and look at it as something that is being presented to you by an author. Kubrick almost always keeps the viewer at arm's length, keeping you, in my opinion, more fascinated with what is going on than emotionally invested. Most of the characters in his movies don't really reveal their backstories or have grand character arcs where they learn a valuable lesson and change. But despite always having strong, impactful endings, Kubrick's movies never really seem to end when the movie's over. I find myself continuously thinking about them and feeling the need to revisit them like a great, catchy song. When asked why he decided to do the William Tell scene in fast motion, Kubrick said, "It seemed to me a good way to satirize what had become fairly common use of slow motion to solemnize this sort of thing, and turn it into art." The William Tell overture also seemed a good musical joke to counter the standard Bach accompaniment. It seems a major influence for the scene comes from a Japanese queer film from 1969 titled Funeral Parade of Roses. And that isn't the only reference to the film. If you're ever in the mood to watch something super offbeat and insane with tons of interesting cinematic techniques, then you should definitely check this out. Kubrick also seems to reference 2001: A Space Odyssey in A Clockwork Orange. And no, I don't mean the soundtrack in the record store. Kubrick followed 2001 with A Clockwork Orange, and if you watch them back to back, you'll see 2001 end with this image, and A Clockwork Orange begin with this image. In kind of a cheeky way, Kubrick follows a look from an evolved being to a look from a person that contains many of the worst possible traits of humanity. Another instance of Kubrick making things interesting happens in a joyride the Droogs take on their way to commit their ultra-violence. Vincent Labruto says that these shots were, quote, photographed on a process stage with the passing scenery in the nighttime background plate glowing in a ghostly fashion. The high contrast rear projection footage is overly bright and nearly monochromatic, recalling a similar effect created for F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, in scenes featuring the vampire's black carriage eerily racing through the night. Intercut shots representing Alex's POV of the road were slightly undercranked and ostensibly lit by the car's headlights. Kubrick had used many projection effects on the previous 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Labruto says that Kubrick likely used this heightened reality to, quote, convey the euphoria of his drug-addled characters. Kubrick also used rear projection for this shot in Eyes Wide Shut to make it look more dreamlike. Things get even more fantastical when we actually enter Alex's deranged mind in the form of daydreams or thoughts or drug-induced wig-outs. Kubrick said, "The book describes things stylistically that I couldn't film." For these sequences, Kubrick looked at old Hollywood movies. Some of the images are from stock footage, but others are near parodies of other movies. When asked about the biblical scene of Alex whipping Jesus, Kubrick said, "I thought Alex would have imagined it that way. That's why he uses the American accent we've heard so many times before in biblical movies when he shouts, 'Move on there.'" As for the scene of Alex listening to Beethoven, Kubrick said, "I just wanted to have him visualizing some very inappropriate images one might think of while listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Violent images. The caveman sequence came from 1,000,000 Years BC, the film with Raquel Welch. Alex would imagine things he had seen in films." Labruto also reveals that this shot was, quote, based on a shot seen in the black comedy Western Cat Ballou, which Kubrick elaborately restaged.
Thank you, sir. God bless you.
I'll leave you with one last quote from Kubrick on intuition and adaptability. He said, "As much as there are hours in the day and days in the week, I think about film almost continuously. I try to visualize it, and I try to work out every conceivable variation of ideas which might exist with respect to the various scenes. But I found that when you come down to the day the scene is going to be shot and you arrive on the location with the actors, having had the experience of already seeing some of the scenes shot, somehow it's always different. You find out that you've not really explored the scene to its fullest extent. You may have been thinking about it incorrectly, or you may simply not have discovered one of the variations which now in context with everything else you have shot is simply better than anything you had previously thought of. The reality of the final moment just before shooting is so powerful that all previous analysis must yield before the impressions you receive under these circumstances. And unless you use this feedback to your positive advantage, unless you adjust to it, adapt to it, and accept the sometimes terrifying weaknesses it can expose, you can never realize the most out of your film. Are you like me and often find yourself endlessly scrolling through a streaming service's catalog looking for something to watch? It's difficult when the bad and the good are all mixed together. Well, Mubi has solved this problem in a really unique way. Mubi hosts just 30 films, hand-selected by film lovers, not an algorithm, and they add a new movie every single day. Mubi hosts a variety of great movies, ranging from award-winning masterpieces and festival fresh gems, to cult classics and those hard-to-find movies that you always keep an eye out for. What I love about Mubi is how they curate their releases into retrospectives, specials, and specific subgenres like apocalyptic movies. Right now, you can watch one of my favorite Jean-Pierre Melville movies, Les Doulos, starring the ultra-cool Jean-Paul Belmondo from Breathless. It has one of the most suspenseful endings I've ever seen. Definitely make sure to check it out. And then join the discussion in Mubi's community of film lovers. Try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/CinemaTyler. That's mubi.com/CinemaTyler for a whole month of great cinema for free. Or join me on Patreon at the $5 level and get extended access to Mubi as a perk. Thanks for watching.